Walk into any old grove on the Northern California coast and you will find trees standing in circles, perfect circles. 8 or 10 trunks, each of them 200 feet tall, arranged around an empty center like a colonnade nobody built. Botanists have a name for this. They call it a fairy ring, and they will tell you exactly what it means. Those trunks are not separate trees, they are sprouts. Every one of them grew out of the base of a parent that is no longer standing there. So the circle is not a mystery. The circle is a measurement, and the question nobody in the visitor center wants to sit with is what the thing in the middle looked like. Here is the part that is not disputed by anyone. Coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, is one of the very few conifers on Earth that can sprout from its own base. Most cone-bearing trees cannot do this. Cut a pine and you get a stump. Cut a redwood and the stump goes to work. Along the collar, where the trunk meets the root system, there is a swollen mass of undifferentiated tissue, a burl, packed with dormant buds that have been waiting there for centuries, doing nothing at all. Damage the parent and those buds wake up. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Fire, flood, wind, a logging crew, it does not matter. The signal is the loss of the top. Within a season you get a ring of new shoots pushing out of the dead wood, and within a century you get 8 new redwoods standing in a ring around an absence. And this tree is genuinely strange at the level of its own instructions. When the coast redwood genome was finally sequenced and published by the Redwood Genome Project around 2019, it came in at about 26 billion base pairs, something like 9 times the size of the human genome, and it is hexaploid, meaning it carries 6 copies of each chromosome where you and I carry 2. There is exactly one other known hexaploid conifer of this kind. Nobody has a satisfying explanation for why the tallest organism on Earth needed 6 sets of instructions to build itself. It is the sort of fact that gets a paragraph in a press release and then sits there, unexplained, for a decade. So, the fairy ring is a scar with a shape. The diameter of the ring is the diameter of what used to be there. That is not a fringe claim. That is how park interpreters explain it on the boardwalk. And in most groves the ring is 15 or 20 feet across, which is a normal redwood, and everyone moves on to the gift shop. But not all of them are 15 feet across. There are rings on the Humboldt and Del Norte coast that run 40 and 50 feet in diameter. There are stump platforms in the cutover ground behind the parks that logging crews photographed men standing on in rows, 8 and 10 and 12 men across the cut face, arms folded, hats on, because that photograph was the product, not the lumber. The photograph. And when you look at a ring of living 200-foot trees standing around a hole that wide, the arithmetic gets uncomfortable, because the tallest living redwood on Earth is about 380 feet, and the tallest one anyone has credibly recorded from the cutting era was maybe 420, and the ratio of trunk width to height in a redwood is not a mystery either. It is a fairly tight relationship. Run that relationship backward on a 50-foot base and you are not describing a redwood. You are describing something the species does not currently do. That is the whole argument, and it fits in one sentence. Every redwood alive today is a sprout off the shoulder of a stump. The living forest is the second growth. The question is only whether the first growth was the same size as this one. Let us do the honest version first, because the honest version is genuinely strong and it deserves the floor. Modern biology has an answer for the ceiling, and it is a beautiful piece of work. In 2004, a team led by George Koch published a study in Nature that did something nobody had bothered to do. They climbed to the tops of the tallest redwoods and measured what the leaves were doing up there. What they found is that near the crown of a very tall tree, the leaves are physically starving for water. Water moves up a tree in a continuous thread under tension, pulled by evaporation at the leaf surface. Gravity fights that thread the whole way. At a certain height, the tension becomes so extreme that the thread breaks and air bubbles form in the plumbing, and the leaf cannot expand properly because it never has enough turgor. Koch and his colleagues measured the leaves shrinking and stiffening with height exactly as predicted, and they put the theoretical maximum for a redwood somewhere between about 380 and 430 feet, which is, almost precisely, where the tallest known trees actually stop. That is not hand-waving. That is a physical law producing a number, and then the forest agreeing with the number. It is one of the cleanest predictions in plant science. And it also does something the revisionist reading has to answer. Because if the ceiling is set by water tension and gravity, then a tree twice this tall is not merely rare. It is impossible, not impossible under current conditions, impossible, full stop, unless the conditions themselves were different, which is exactly the door the alternative history walks through, and this is where I want to be careful with you, because that door is real, but the room behind it is mostly furnished with guesses. The argument goes like this: if the ceiling is set by air pressure, water tension and gravity, and the ceiling used to be higher, then one of those three used to be different. Denser air, more oxygen, a different pull. And people making that argument reach for the same evidence every time, which is the fossil insects. Meganeura, the dragonfly with a wingspan approaching 2.5 feet. Arthropleura, the millipede longer than a man. Those are not internet inventions, those are museum specimens, and the mainstream explanation for them is elevated atmospheric oxygen in the Carboniferous, which is itself modelled rather than measured. John Harrison and others have raised insects in hyperoxic chambers and gotten bigger ones, so the mechanism has some experimental support. But notice the gap, because it matters. Giant insects are Carboniferous, roughly 300 million years ago. Coast redwood as a species is nowhere near that old, and the fairy rings in Humboldt are centuries old, not eons. You cannot borrow the Carboniferous sky to explain a stump that a man with a crosscut saw made in 1889. If the parent trees in those rings were vastly larger than their sprouts, they were larger recently, and that is a much harder claim, and nobody making it has ever produced the one thing that would settle it, which is a single intact base of that scale with countable rings. Hold that thought, because the record does contain something adjacent, and it is stranger than most people realize. Start with the range. Redwoods today occupy a strip of coast about 450 miles long and rarely more than 30 miles wide. That is the entire natural distribution of the tallest organism on the planet, a ribbon, but the fossil record shows redwood and its close relatives once ringed the entire northern hemisphere. There are redwood fossils in Greenland. There are redwood fossils in Siberia. On Axel Heiberg Island, deep inside the Canadian Arctic, there is a fossil forest about 45 million years old where the stumps are not petrified at all. They are mummified. The wood is still wood. You can pick up a splinter of it and burn it. Those trees grew in continuous winter darkness for months at a time at a latitude where nothing like them can survive now, which tells you the world they grew in was not the world we are standing in. Then there is the case of Metasequoia, the dawn redwood, which is the best cautionary tale in this entire subject. In 1941, a Japanese paleobotanist named Shigeru Miki examined fossil foliage that everyone had been filing under sequoia and concluded it was a distinct genus. He named it from the fossils because that is all anybody had. The tree was extinct. That same period, a Chinese forester came across a huge, unfamiliar deciduous conifer standing in a village in Hubei, being treated as a shrine tree by the people who lived there. It took several years and several hands for the identification to travel, and in 1946 the announcement was made that Miki's fossil genus was standing alive in a Chinese valley. The Arnold Arboretum funded a seed collection expedition in 1948, and today dawn redwoods are planted in city parks on 4 continents. Sit with the shape of that. A tree known only from stone, declared extinct, was alive the entire time in a place the people who lived there had always known about. The knowledge was never lost. It was only unpublished. And the thing that made it real was not the villagers who had been standing under it for generations. It was a herbarium sheet and a journal article and a funded expedition. That is the actual pattern this whole niche keeps circling. Not conspiracy, custody. Somebody decides what counts as a record. Now consider prototaxites, since we are asking what larger used to look like. Fossils from the Devonian, 400 million years back, of an organism that stood 26 feet tall and 3 feet wide, in a landscape where nothing else got past your knee. It was described in the 1850s and immediately fought over. "A rotted conifer," said one camp. "A giant algae," said another. In 2007, Kevin Boyce and colleagues ran the carbon isotopes and concluded it was most likely a fungus, an enormous vertical fungus towering over a world of ankle-high plants, and even that is still argued. The largest terrestrial organism of its era, and we cannot agree what kingdom it belonged to. So the fossil record does contain giants, and it does contain organisms nobody can classify, and it does contain forests standing in places that make no sense today. What it does not contain, so far, is a coast redwood stump the size of a house. Now, let us go where the money is, because that is where this story actually stops being about botany. In 1848, the entire coast redwood range was standing. Estimates run around 2 million acres of old growth. By the middle of the 20th century, roughly 95% of that was gone, and the fraction of original old growth surviving today is somewhere near 5%, most of it in a scatter of parks. That is one of the fastest and most complete liquidations of a biological asset in recorded history, and it happened in about 100 years, in a country with newspapers, courts, and cameras. The trigger was gold, not redwood, gold. When the rush hit in 1849, San Francisco went from a village to a city of tens of thousands in under 2 years, and cities need boards. Redwood is straight-grained, splits clean, resists rot, and does not burn easily, which in a boomtown that kept catching fire was worth more than beauty. So the forest was not cut because anyone wanted redwood specifically. It was cut because it was standing next to a sudden bottomless demand for framing lumber, water tanks, shingles, railroad ties and wine casks, and because it was, legally speaking, free. That last part is the part worth slowing down on. The mechanism was the Timber and Stone Act of 1878. On its face it was a settler law. Any citizen could buy up to 160 acres of land judged unfit for farming at $2.50 an acre for personal use. The stated purpose was to let a homesteader get his own timber. What actually happened is that lumber companies hired men off the docks in San Francisco and Portland, marched them to the land office in groups, paid them a small fee to file a claim in their own name, and had them sign the deed over on the courthouse steps the same afternoon. Sailors, saloon patrons, whoever could hold a pen. Congressional investigations and later prosecutions documented this repeatedly. Entire watersheds moved into corporate hands 160 acres at a time at the price of a cheap meal per acre for trees that had been growing since before the Norman conquest. That is the whole trick, and it is not hidden, a law written in the language of the smallholder, executed at the scale of the syndicate. The redwoods were not stolen in the night. They were purchased legally at a price set by a Congress that had decided the land was worthless. And the price is the tell. $2.50 an acre presumes the value is in farming the dirt. It prices the trees at nothing, because in 1878 the trees were an obstacle to agriculture in the mental model of the men writing the statute. Every one of these stories runs through a moment where somebody sets the price of a thing before anybody has agreed what the thing is. Then there is the measuring, which is its own quiet scandal. Lumber is sold by the board foot, and to sell a standing tree you need to guess how many board feet are inside it. That guess is made using a log rule. And in the 19th century American mills used several competing ones. The Doyle rule, the Scribner rule, the International rule. They do not agree. Doyle, in particular, substantially underestimates the yield of large logs, which means a mill buying timber by Doyle scale pays for less wood than it takes home. The gap is not small. On big logs it can run a quarter of the volume, or worse. Farmers and small landowners selling standing timber to mills that used the buyer's preferred rule lost that difference every single time, and most of them never knew a different rule existed. So before a saw touched anything, the arithmetic had already picked a side. Whoever controls the unit controls the trade. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. That is as true of a log rule as it is of a survey map or an assay office. Now, the stumps. In 1853, a crew stripped the bark off a giant sequoia in Calaveras Grove, up in the Sierra, in strips numbered so it could be reassembled. This was the tree they called the Mother of the Forest. The bark shell was shipped east and put on exhibition, eventually at the Crystal Palace in New York, and the response was not awe. The response was that it was a fraud. Audiences assumed it was a stitched-together hoax from California, because no tree could be that big and therefore no tree was. The exhibitors had, in the most literal sense, failed to sell the truth. They tried again in 1893. A crew felled the General Noble tree in what is now Kings Canyon country, cut a section of the lower trunk into interlocking pieces, and reassembled it at the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition as a hollow room visitors could walk inside. It was again widely described as the California hoax. And that phrase is worth keeping, because it names something exact. When the evidence exceeds the audience's model of the world, the evidence gets reclassified as a lie, not examined, reclassified. Meanwhile, in Converse Basin, one of the finest groves of giant sequoia that ever stood was cut almost completely between the 1890s and about 1918 by the Hume-Bennett operation. Sequoia wood is brittle. When a tree that size hits the ground, it shatters, and the crews lost enormous fractions of every trunk, in some cases most of it. So they cut the largest living things on the continent, destroyed the majority of the wood in the act of felling it, and turned a meaningful share of what survived into grape stakes, fence posts, and shingles. It was not even profitable. The operation failed. The grove is still mostly stumps, and the single big tree left standing, the bull tree, was spared and named after the man supervising the cut. I want to be clear that I am not going to pretend the mainstream account of any of that is in question. It is not. The documents are excellent. What I am pointing at is a rhythm. The thing gets priced before it gets understood, it gets cut before it gets counted, and the counting that does happen is done by whoever is buying. There is a smaller version of the same rhythm sitting right on the highway, and most people drive through it without noticing what it is. Starting in the 1930s, operators along the Redwood Highway cut tunnels straight through the trunks of living old-growth trees so that automobiles could be photographed driving inside them. The chandelier tree in Leggett, the tunnel trees at Myers Flat and Klamath. The hole in the chandelier tree is about 6 feet wide and 9 feet tall, and it was cut in the 1930s specifically because the new tourist economy needed a photograph that could not be taken anywhere else. Charge a fee at the gate, sell the postcard, and the tree pays rent forever. Consider what that actually is. A tree that had been alive since before the Roman Empire was converted from lumber into signage, not destroyed, monetized in a different column of the ledger. And the reason that happened is that by the 1930s, the highway had made the trees reachable, which meant the value of a standing redwood next to a road was no longer only the board feet inside it. It was the traffic outside it. The same forest, repriced by the arrival of the automobile. That is why the giant sequoia stump in Chicago and the tunnel in Leggett belong in the same paragraph. In both cases, the wood was the raw material for an image, and the image was the product being sold. Which brings us to who did the saving, because that story has an edge on it that rarely gets mentioned. The Save the Redwoods League was founded in 1918, and it is genuinely responsible for the existence of most of what you can walk through today. Memorial groves, land purchases, the entire model of buying forest with private donations and handing it to the state. Effective, durable, and still operating. Its founders were Madison Grant, John C., Merriam, and Henry Fairfield Osborn. Merriam was a serious paleontologist. Osborn ran the American Museum of Natural History. And Madison Grant wrote The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, one of the most influential works of scientific racism ever published in the United States, a book that fed directly into American immigration restriction and was admired in Europe by people whose admiration is a permanent stain. Grant thought in terms of ancient superior stock being overrun by lesser types, and he thought that way about trees and about people with the same vocabulary. The League has publicly acknowledged this history in recent years rather than burying it. I am not telling you that to score a point. I am telling you because it is the same instinct in both directions. The idea that there was a greater world before this one, that what stands now is a degraded remnant, and that somebody enlightened must take custody of the last of it. That is the conservation impulse, and it is also the eugenic impulse. And in 1918 they were sitting in the same room signing the same charter. Every version of the lost golden age story eventually gets asked what it wants to do about the present, and the answers have not always been gentle. Now, the modern chapter, which is the cleanest financial story in the whole subject. The Pacific Lumber Company of Scotia, California, held the largest remaining privately owned old-growth redwood in the world, tens of thousands of acres of it, in Humboldt County. For generations it had been run conservatively, cutting selectively, keeping the mill town employed, carrying a famously overfunded pension plan and almost no debt. In corporate terms, it was a company sitting on an enormous underpriced asset with a fat cash cushion. In the 1980s, that description was a target painted on your back. In 1985, Charles Hurwitz, through his company Maxam, took Pacific Lumber over in a hostile acquisition financed with high-yield debt underwritten in the Drexel-Burnham-Lambert orbit that Michael Milken had built. The takeover loaded the company with debt it had never carried. To service that debt, the new management roughly doubled the rate of cutting and moved into clear-cutting old growth that the previous owners had left standing. The overfunded pension plan was terminated and the surplus captured, with annuities purchased from Executive Life, an insurer that itself collapsed a few years later. Read that sequence again, because it is the whole thesis in miniature. A forest that had been growing for 2,000 years was converted into cash flow to service the interest on the loan that was used to buy it. The trees were not the point. The trees were collateral. What followed was one of the longest-running environmental conflicts in American history. Earth first. Organizers, tree sits, road blockades, mass arrests. In 1990, Judy Bari, one of the principal organizers of the Redwood summer campaign, was severely injured when a pipe bomb detonated under the driver's seat of her car in Oakland. She and Darrell Cherney were arrested and publicly accused of transporting the bomb themselves. No charges were ever filed. They sued, and in 2002 a federal jury found that FBI agents and Oakland police had violated their civil rights and awarded $4.5 million. Bari had died of cancer years before the verdict. In 1997, a 23-year-old woman named Julia Butterfly Hill climbed a 1,000-year-old redwood in Humboldt County that the activists had named Luna and refused to come down. She stayed in that tree for 738 days, through winter storms, through helicopters, through a siege of floodlights and horns. She came down in December 1999 after an agreement that protected the tree and a buffer around it. Somebody attacked Luna with a chainsaw the following year, cutting more than halfway through the trunk. The tree was braced with steel and is still alive. And the resolution, when it came, was a transaction. In 1999, the Headwaters Forest deal transferred about 7,500 acres, including the largest unprotected old-growth grove, to public ownership for about $480 million in combined federal and state money. Pacific Lumber filed for bankruptcy in 2007, and the assets moved on to other owners. So the arc is complete. Trees bought from the public domain for $2.50 an acre in the 1880s were bought back by the public a century later for something on the order of $60,000 an acre. The wood never moved. Only the title did, and the price, and the story about what the thing was for. There is one more turn, and it is happening now. Today the redwoods are being repriced again, and this time the product is not lumber, it is carbon. Coast redwood forest holds more carbon per acre than any other forest type ever measured, by a wide margin. Standing biomass in an old grove runs to enormous figures, and redwood is unusually rot-resistant, so the carbon stays put. That makes intact redwood forest extremely valuable inside a carbon market, and California has one, the Cap-and-Trade Compliance Offset Program, in which landowners can be paid for keeping forests standing. Which sounds like the happy ending, and might be. But the accounting is contested in ways that should feel familiar by now. Independent analyses, including widely discussed work by researchers at Carbon Plan, published in 2021, argued that the way baselines were drawn in the California Forest Offset Program produced a large volume of credits that did not represent real additional carbon storage, on the order of tens of millions of tons. The industry and the regulator disputed the methodology. The argument is ongoing, and I am not going to pretend it is settled. But look at the shape of it. A rule is written. The rule defines a unit. The unit is bought and sold at scale before anyone has fully agreed the unit measures what it claims to measure. That is Doyle scale versus Scribner scale, 4 generations later in a different currency. And the secrecy has come back too, which is the strangest note to end on. In 2006, Chris Atkins and Michael Taylor found a redwood in Redwood National Park that measured over 379 feet, the tallest tree ever reliably recorded. They named it Hyperion. The exact location has never been officially published. In 2022, the National Park Service closed the area around it entirely, with a stated penalty of up to 6 months in jail and a $5,000 fine for being there, because unofficial trails cut by visitors had trampled the root zone and the base of the tree was being damaged by the attention. Meanwhile, burl poaching became enough of a problem that Redwood National and State Parks began closing the Newton B. Drury Scenic Parkway at night. People were cutting the burls off the sides of living trees with chainsaws to sell to woodworkers, because burl wood is figured and expensive. Which means that the exact tissue this whole story started with, the swollen collar of dormant buds that lets a redwood sprout a fairy ring around its own stump, has a street price and a black market. So here is where we are. We know for a fact that the redwood forest you can walk through is not the original one. 95% of that is gone, and the trees standing now are, in enormous numbers, sprouts from the bases of trees that were cut inside the last 170 years. That is not a theory, that is inventory. We know the fairy rings mark the diameter of what stood there before, because that is the mechanism by which they form. We know that the science says there is a hard physical ceiling on how tall any tree can be, and that the ceiling matches the tallest trees we can find, which is either a beautiful confirmation of the physics or a very tidy way of declaring that nothing larger was ever possible. We know that a genus can be declared extinct from fossils while it is standing alive in a valley where people have been holding ceremonies under it for centuries. We know that when a tree too large for the audience's imagination was shipped east and displayed, the audience called it a fraud. And we know that at every single stage, from the Timber and Stone Act to the log rule to the junk bond to the carbon credit, the thing that determined the fate of the forest was not what the forest was. It was who held the pen that defined the unit. I do not think there were 400-foot wide trees on the California coast in 1700. I have looked for the stump that would prove it, and it is not there, and a claim that large needs a base with rings in it, not a wide circle of sprouts and a feeling. But I also notice that we are standing in the second growth, arguing about the first, using measurements invented by the people who cut it, inside a legal framework that priced it at $2.50 an acre before anyone had counted a single ring. And I notice that the most protected tree in the world right now is protected by not telling you where it is. That is not evidence of anything, by itself. Rare things are protected quietly for ordinary reasons, and the ordinary reasons here are good ones, but it is a familiar arrangement. The most extraordinary specimen of the species has been removed from the public record for its own safety by an agency acting in good faith, and the practical effect is that the thing you would most want to measure is the one thing you are not permitted to stand next to. Go find a fairy ring. They are not hard to locate. Stand in the middle of it, in the hollow where the parent used to be, and pace out the diameter yourself. Then look up at the sprouts, which are 200 feet of living tree, and remember that every one of them is a branch off something that is not there anymore. Then make of that what you will.